They said there was a statue of bronze, a god with outstretched arms, its palms turned up and tilted toward the ground, standing above a pit of fire. And they said that when the priests laid a child upon those hands, the small body would roll slowly down the sloping arms and fall into the flames below. They said the drums beat loudly and the flutes played, so that no one in the crowd would hear the crying. And they said the mothers were forbidden to weep. This is what the Greeks and the Romans wrote about the city of Carthage. But there is a problem with that story. It was written by Carthage's enemies, and when Rome finally destroyed the city, it burned its libraries, and every book the Carthaginians ever wrote turned to ash. For 2,000 years, historians looked at those accounts and said, "This is propaganda. This is the lie the victors tell about the people they slaughtered." And then, one night in 1921, a man knelt in the dirt outside the ruins of Carthage and began to dig. To understand what he found, you have to understand what Carthage was. It began around 800 BC as a colony of Phoenician traders from the city of Tyre on the coast of what is now Lebanon. Legend gave it a founder, a princess named Elissa, whom the Romans called Dido, fleeing a murderous brother. Within a few centuries, this small trading post had become the richest city in the Western Mediterranean, a naval superpower whose merchant fleets reached Britain and the coast of Africa, whose famous circular war harbor could hide 200 warships, and whose armies, under a general named Hannibal, once brought Rome itself to the very edge of destruction. And that is precisely why Carthage does not get to speak for itself. In 146 BC, at the end of the Third Punic War, Rome took the city and did something extraordinary even by its own standards. It razed Carthage to the ground. It burned the buildings. It sold the survivors into slavery. And it destroyed the libraries. Almost every word the Carthaginians ever wrote about themselves is gone. What we have instead are the words of the men who killed them. Which brings us back to that night in 1921. In December of that year, a local official named Paul Gilly noticed something strange in the fields outside the ruins of ancient Carthage. A man was out there in the darkness, on his hands and knees, quietly digging up carved stone slabs by moonlight and selling them to antiquities dealers. Gielli and a colleague named François Icard did something clever. They bought the land, and then they began to excavate it properly. What they uncovered was not a tomb and not a temple. It was a sacred enclosure, an open-air sanctuary, and it was packed with stone markers, thousands of them, carved with symbols and inscriptions. The site was dug next by a flamboyant, self-styled count named Byron Kundaprorok, and then far more carefully by the American archaeologist Francis Kelsey. And as they went down, layer beneath layer beneath layer, they began to find the jars. They were small, plain clay urns, buried close together, layer upon layer, generation upon generation. And inside, almost every one of them, were the burned bones of a baby, not a few. Archaeologists now estimate that as many as 20,000 urns may have been buried in this one sanctuary in the 2 centuries between 400 and 200 BC alone. And the site was in use, in some form, from the 8th century BC right up until the city's destruction. More than 6,000 carved stone markers, called stelae, were recovered from it. Some urns held the bones of young lambs instead. Some held both. And above them all stood the stones, dedicated to 2 gods, Baal-Hamon and the goddess Tanit. Modern scholars borrowed a word from the Hebrew Bible and named the place a Tophet. It is not what the Carthaginians called it. We do not know what they called it. but we do know some of what they wrote because the stones themselves are inscribed. Again and again, across the stelae of Carthage and of other Phoenician cities, appears a single word, mok. It describes an offering. And sometimes the inscription is more specific still. There is a phrase, mok adam, which appears to mean the offering of a human being. And there is another, mok imor, which means the offering of a lamb, given in place of a child. That second phrase is important, and we will come back to it. There is also a carved image, unearthed in 1921, which archaeologists call the priest stele. It shows a robed figure walking, and in his arms he is carrying a small child. These are not the words of Greeks or of Romans. They are the words the Carthaginians carved into stone in their own language above the jars. And yet, in 2010, a team led by the anthropologist Jeffrey Schwartz published a study that stopped the argument in its tracks. They examined the cremated remains inside 348 of the urns and reached a startling conclusion. Most of these infants, they said, had died before birth, or within the first days of life. They were far too young to have been chosen for anything. What the Tophet really was, Schwartz argued, was a cemetery, a sacred place where a people who suffered brutal rates of infant mortality laid to rest the babies they had lost. And the horror stories, enemy propaganda, exactly as historians had long suspected. This was not a fringe view, and it carried a moral weight of its own. For centuries, the image of the baby-burning Carthaginian had been used to paint an entire African civilization as monstrous, a convenient story for Rome and later for Europe's own empires. There were very good reasons to want it not to be true. So the archaeologists went back to the bones. A team led by Patricia Smith, working with the archaeologist Lawrence Steger, re-examined the remains from 334 urns and focused on the one thing that does not lie: teeth. Tooth formation is a precise clock in the first weeks of life, and what the teeth showed was that most of the infants in those jars were not newborns at all. They were around 1 to 2 months old. That matters enormously, because natural infant mortality in the ancient world does not look like that. It spikes violently at birth, and in the days immediately after. It does not cluster at 4 to 8 weeks of age. Something was choosing these children, and there was one more detail buried inside Schwartz's own data. In 70 of the urns his team examined, the sex of the child could be determined. 38 were female, 26 were male. Nature does not sort infants that way. In 2014, after weighing the archaeology, the inscriptions, and the ancient texts together, the Oxford historian Josephine Quinn concluded that the evidence for child sacrifice at Carthage is, in her word, overwhelming, and that the right response is not to look away, but to try to understand it. So try to understand it. These were not monsters. They were a people living in a world of plague, of drought, of famine, and of war. A world in which everything you had could be taken from you in a single season. And they believed, as many ancient peoples believed, that the gods answered gifts, that the greater the gift, the greater the mercy, and the greatest gift a family possessed was a child. The evidence suggests it was the elite who gave, and not the poor. These were the children of the great houses, offered publicly and commemorated with a carved stone that carried the family's name. And that phrase on the stele, Molk Imor, the lamb given instead, tells us something almost unbearable. It means that in some circumstances, a family could pay a substitute, which means the choice was real. Diodorus tells us what happened when the choice became desperate. In 310 BC, A Greek army under Agathocles of Syracuse landed in Africa, burned its own ships so that no man could retreat, and marched on Carthage. The city panicked. Its people decided they had neglected their oldest god. And so, Diodorus writes, they gave him 500 children, 200 chosen from the noblest families in the city, and 300 more surrendered voluntarily by households who feared they were under suspicion. Diodorus wrote that account 2.5 centuries after the event, and he was no friend of Carthage. Treat the number with caution. Do not treat the practice with caution. So where does that leave us? The urns are real. The inscriptions are real. The word carved on the stones is their word, not ours. And the age of the children inside those jars does not match the shape of a natural death. Most scholars today accept that the Carthaginians practiced some form of ritual child sacrifice. What remains genuinely fiercely argued is how often, on what scale, and for whom. Perhaps it was rare and reserved for catastrophe. Perhaps it was routine among the great families. We may never know, because Rome saw to that. It burned the city, it burned the books, and it left us with nothing but the enemy's version and a field of small clay jars beneath the sand. 20,000 of them, each one sealed, each one buried, each one marked with a stone. Carthage cannot answer the charge, but it did leave a record, and that record is not what its defenders hoped, and not quite what its accusers claimed. If you would like to walk through more lost moments of history like this one, subscribe, and I will see you in the next story.